Okay, so this is Jen the Liberty Lion, and I have just a few things I want to talk about before I start talking about the topic of this video. And the first thing I want to mention is the run for president by Ron Paul. Years ago, when he was running for president, he was on a few shows where he did debates with the other runners, the other people running. And on one of these news outlets, he was given, I think it was something like 6 minutes to talk, of total talking time for the entire debate, whereas the other people were given an exponentially greater period of time to talk. So in the libertarian community, we were told, hey, if you want to find out what's going on and complain about this news outlet doing this to Ron Paul, then you should write to the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and complain about this news outlet. So a lot of people did that, and I was one of them. The letter I got back from the FCC stated something like, this news outlet was listed as entertainment. And because it was listed as entertainment, it didn't come under the same rules and regulations as an actual journalistic news media source. So when I first started my channel, I had listed it, I don't know, as something like political science or government and political science, something like that. And when I started to think about how much I was getting hit by YouTube and getting threatened to have my channel shut down, I had to rethink what I was doing, how I was putting information out, what so-called laws I was possibly breaking, and how I could correct this or get around it. And so one of the things I decided to do was to list my channel instead of whatever it was before: political science, government, law, politics, whatever. I just switched it to entertainment. And when I did that, I no longer got any hits from YouTube. I was not threatened with my channel being shut down anymore. So one of the things that I think is important for us to remember is that just because the channel's listed as entertainment doesn't mean that it doesn't have true and factual information in it. Just like if a person writes a novel, they can still put mathematical equations in the fictional novel that they wrote, which are true and accurate, even though it's in a fictional novel. So even though this channel's listed as entertainment, it doesn't mean that it doesn't contain real information, factual information, good information. So it's just sort of a way of getting around all the BS that YouTube makes us jump through, all the hoops that we have to jump through to get the information out, and not be constantly threatened or shut down for 30 days or 60 days or whatever. And then you're only given a few options as far as how you can get your channel back up. The other thing I wanted to mention, and I know that these things are not going to seem related to the actual topic of this video, but they really are. The other thing I wanted to mention was that how do we know what a sheep is, or sheeple? How do we know what they are? So I've done just a little bit of research on this, and I think what I'm about to tell you is pretty accurate. Why do we call certain people sheeple? Why do we refer to them as being a lower animal like a sheep? Well, we all kind of know they don't think. They don't think on their own. They make bad decisions, okay? So I came across this video of these guys. I forget what they're called. There's 4 guys, and then they observe people during interrogations and stuff, and they give you their opinion on whether or not they're lying, or they're telling the truth, or they're mostly telling the truth, but they're hiding something. And one of the things that they talked about was how people move their eyes. So the guy that was talking said that somebody had written him an email and asked him, if people shift their eyes a lot during an interrogation or while they're talking, does that mean that they're like psychopath or something? And he said, no, that means they're thinking. So in their brain, they're not looking at what's in front of them, their reality in front of them. They're looking at what they're thinking about in their brain. And they're sorting through bits and pieces of information, and I think of it, at least in my brain, as I'm going into these little boxes, and I'm getting stuff out of each of the box, and I'm putting it together into either a new category, or I'm trying to find in my head some patterns so that I can get a little bit of information everywhere and then put it together to spot a new pattern. And that goes, I guess, back into my training as an accident investigator. So I just look at everything. I'm looking at everything in my brain, not what's in front of me, and my eyes are moving. Well, when you think, and I got this from another source of information, a medical journal, when you think, your brain waves change, you go into a different brainwave state. So if you are someone who doesn't think, you have a lower brainwave state. So I have some experience, and I'm a certified hypnotist. So when I hypnotize somebody, I'm putting them into a different brainwave state to make them highly suggestible. So sheeple, because they live in a basically lower or different brainwave state, they're easy to influence. They're easy to put into a trance. They're easy to make them think a certain way. And now, if you remember, we've gone over locution, illocution, and perlocutionary acts. So locution is a statement, and then you have the illocution, what you think about the statement or your interpretation of a statement, and then you have the act that you perform. This all kind of ties in. So we have to think to know what to act, right? Or if we don't think, then we act the way someone wants us to act. So if I put somebody in a brainwave state that allows me to make suggestions to them, anybody can do it. A politician can do it during a speech. Sermons, when you go to church, they're doing it during a sermon a lot of times. They're putting you in a trance, in a relaxed state, and it can be done in a number of ways. When you go into this relaxed state, you become suggestible. And then you do the perlocutionary act. You go and do the thing that you know that they want you to do. So people who are analytical, are mathematical, are thinking, and are in a higher brainwave state, they don't easily go into a trance. And so that's that one guy standing there saying, are y'all buying this bullshit? And all the sheeple are going, bleh, because they're buying it, because they're not thinking, because they're easily put into a trance. Okay, so sheep don't move their eyes a lot. A lot of lower animals don't really move their eyes a lot. They move their eye if something catches their attention. But they don't move their eyes because they're in their brain really thinking. If you watch animals, if there's a loud noise, they'll move towards it because they have a desire to preserve themselves. It's an instinct, self-preservation. The instinct to self-preserve. We all have it. That's, fight or flight, or, what have you. We have our instincts to preserve our own life. So to understand animals and sheeple and people who don't think, you watch their eyes. If they don't really move their eyes too much, they're probably not really thinking a lot, because thinking involves a certain level of stress. People get a little bit stressed from thinking. And so when someone is thinking, you can see, because they're kind of like moving their eyes a lot. Now, sometimes people can get into a very, very hyper focused state, and they stare straight on, and they're just thinking things in their head. They're not really moving their eyes a lot, but that doesn't mean that they're not thinking. Okay, so I've not really, I can get into a hyper focused state, and I don't hear anything around me. I don't see anything around me. I'm completely 100% in my head. And somebody across the room can be calling me and calling me and calling me, and I won't hear them because I'm just 100% in my head. But if there's a loud noise, I might come out of it and look and say, oh, what's that over there? What's going on? So it's not all 100% one way or the other, but generally you can tell when someone is a thinker and someone is not a thinker, because you can see it on their face when they're thinking and their eyes start moving because they're trying to find information related to what you just told them. One of the things I learned probably about maybe 20 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, was how to become a genius, how to become very, very smart. And the best information I got out there on that was to have a lot of experiences. The easiest and cheapest way to have an experience is to read a book. So I read tons and tons and tons and tons of books. Even if I don't completely understand what I'm reading, I read and I keep reading. I read it over if I have to. I read it 10 times if I have to. I just read and read and read. This information that I was studying was more along the lines of how do I get my kid to be a genius, not necessarily for me, but it's helped me a lot. So if you want to be smart, read. And if you want to be smart, you have to have experiences. You go out and have experiences, or you can read and have experiences, or even when you're sitting or watching a TV show, you can have an experience, but the experience is you can be a sheep, you can have an experience as a sheep without really thinking about what you're watching, or you can have an experience where you're watching the TV, but you're actually trying to think about what the author or writer or script writer was trying to convey in this movie. So I prefer movies that aren't just entertainment. They have some sort of logical thing involved in it. It just stimulates me more. Okay, so I'm at 12 minutes and 35 seconds. So now I know you're going to think that these things aren't related, but they really are. I want to talk about the history of taxation as far as what I have studied. So I'm just going to share with you what I have studied and what I think about how it applies today and in the world we live in. Okay, so taxes have to do with whose land you're on. So if I'm on my land, should I be taxed? If I'm on my land and I let other people live on my land, can I tax them? If I let them live on my land and they use my land's natural resources for some sort of profit, some sort of labor so that they can profit, should I tax that? And if I tax that, how much should that tax be? But what if they make things that they didn't get from my land? They brought something from somewhere else and they sat and they made it in their home and didn't involve using the soil or the wood or growing crops or the streams or anything like that, and it was still on my land. Should I tax that? And if I do, how much? So I was reading an encyclopedia or something like that one day, and I was looking up taxes, and this was the oldest thing on taxes that I could find. So as far as I know, this is the original concept of taxes. Now you got to also keep in mind that here in America, not the United States, but in America, in the states, in the republics of the states, we have a type of government that allows us to buy land, keep land, inherit land, and give land to our children so they can inherit our land, so it can stay in the family. there has been a shift and something has happened to where it's harder for regular people to own land, and instead we are basically renting it from someone else, and that requires us to pay taxes on it. So let's talk about what this encyclopedia said. So back in ancient Rome, the ancient Rome, like we're talking about during Caesar's time, they had a system where you could own land, but if you were poor and you didn't own land, whatever wasn't owned could be leased or rented to people who couldn't purchase lands. They didn't have the money, they didn't have family to inherit from. And if a father were to give the land to his son, and he had 4 sons more behind the oldest son, what are those sons to do? Well, if they couldn't afford to go buy their own land, they could ask the government for some scraps of land, some leftover land. And they would contract basically with the government to use the land and its resources, because remember, back in ancient Rome, there's not a whole lot you could do without using something that was a commodity, some resource that came from the earth. Not like today where we can go buy a bag of plastic and make a 3D printed object. So as part of increasing the wealth of the city, the site, CITE, the SIGHT, to which, is a sip or a sieve, a drip, a leak, where the government can take a sip from your cup, and that's all related with the letter C. What they did was they leased the land, but instead of calling it a lease or a rent, they called it a tax. So whenever a person who was poor and was given a piece of land from Rome, and this was just what I read in this dictionary, okay, this is just my information, they paid a percentage of whatever they developed from the land for their profit. So if they grew crops, if they built furniture, they had to cut down the trees to use the wood. If they made pottery, cotton, whatever it was that they did on the land that came from the land, they gave I think 2% back to the government as their lease payment. So it was never a fixed rate. It was never 2% of, all your whole income. It was 2% of whatever you used from the land. And if this year you grew, I'm just going to make up numbers here. Let's say this year you made $20, whatever the Roman coin was, of profit, profit, then you gave 2% of that yield back to the government. But let's say that there was a big storm or a fire and you didn't make any money this year. Well, you didn't owe a tax because you only paid the percent of what you yielded. You paid a percent of the yield, the total yield. Okay, and I'm assuming it was probably some kind of honor system or something. So when you get to certain governments like monarchies, where the monarchy is supposed to have ownership of the land, or the church has ownership of the land, or whatever, you're not free people on that land. You come to that land of your own accord, and when you do, you agree to follow all the rules. And if someone is born on that land, then they're to some extent property of the king or queen, because they're born on that land and the king or queen owns the land. So then the king or queen can do whatever they want. Sure, they're supposed to follow rules. Yes, all of that stuff. There's a lot of things I'm not going to mention in this video. It would be too long. They're supposed to follow rules, but they don't always follow their own rules, which was the reason why the colonists wanted to break away from the British king, right? So in places like Britain back then and now, where it's a monarchy, they are required to pay whatever the monarchy wants. And sure, you might be able to inherit property or give property to your family, but you never will actually own it. So that's the same in Mexico, I think. You don't own land in Mexico. You can buy it, and I think you can pass it down, but if the government wants it, they can just come in and take it. So in this country, we don't have eminent domain in the way other countries do, because America, you're supposed to own your property free and clear. You're supposed to be able to have a allodial title. Over the years, a lot of companies have come in and bought up large pieces of property and then built houses on it, and then they sell you, the way they do with the legal title, and they sell you this but not that, and you can have 6 inches of the dirt or whatever. You own the house but not the land under it. I don't know, whatever they say, right? So you're under legal obligation to obey certain laws and rules and stuff, and I don't think that's the way the founders intended it to be. It's completely different now than what it was then and what it was intended to be. So corporations came in, and people like Rockefeller, they did a lot of work by giving money to colleges and universities and having them alter what they were teaching. And so the indoctrination begins, and eminent domain has become something else. Eminent domain, where it's driven into us that if the government wants it and they're going to use it for public purposes, they can take it. But that's not true, because there are some military posts that have people on those military posts who did not sell their land to the federal government, did not authorize the state to sell it to the federal government. And those places, they pay both a federal and a state tax, because they didn't lose their state citizenship. They didn't gain federal and lose state citizenship. They didn't lose their state rights. They still could vote in state elections. They could still vote in federal elections, which this was a huge issue for a long time in the government. And there's lots and lots of debates on it in Congress as to whether or not these people are federal or whether they're state, civil, whether they were federal taxpayers or state taxpayers. And I think at one point in time, they just threw their hands up and said, we'll just make them both. But there was no requirement back then, and I'm talking about some of the oldest forts in America, right? These people retained their rights. So being an old fort doesn't change the law. So new forts aren't changed. They just have discovered that they should buy lands that aren't already owned. Okay, doesn't have people on it. So there are forts in America where you have a state, you have a fort in the state, and then you have private property inside the fort. And these are private citizens who have to travel through the fort and back onto the fort to get to their private property, who did not succumb to the indoctrinated idea of what eminent domain is. Okay, so the debates, I think, are a lot of times confusing to people who are unfamiliar with the history and the idea of being on federal land and off federal land, or subject to federal law or not subject to federal law. So when the federal government gets money, it's supposed to get money from the states. So the states say to the federal government, the states get together in their Congress, the United States of America in Congress assembled, and they say, we're going to give the federal money for this much money for this much money for this much money for this. And it's down to the cent and 1 cent. So this is not arbitrary amounts for arbitrary things to be done. It's very specific. So if the federal government is supposed to get money from the states, and they're getting money from people not on federal lands, off federal lands, but paying federal taxes, how is that possible? Because it's not supposed to be that way. It's not in the laws, and I know the federal Constitution says tax, impost, excise. Okay, so that is a can of worms, and I will touch on it just for a second. So the federal government can hire people to come onto the military post to do work as contractors. These contractors can be taxed. Civilians who work off the post can come onto the federal post, and they can work for, like, let's say McDonald's that's on a military post. That McDonald's on the military post then has to federally tax these people who are working on the military post, because remember, you have the right to tax what's on your lands, okay? So if these people are coming from the state, going onto the federal government's land, even though they're working at McDonald's, they're still taxed. And again, we're getting confused when we read the laws, and we're saying, well, it says all people have to pay tax, but it's talking about all people on the federal lands because the law was written for the federal government. It wasn't written for the states. It might have been written by the states, but it wasn't written for the states. It was written for the federal government. So the federal government can do things not in the Constitution as the need arises. There are people, dependents. So let's say you're in the military, male or female, and you have a family and you live on post, and your spouse wants to open up a business in military housing. They're allowed to do that. They're allowed to have some supplemental income. This is the idea of always having to ask for permission to have a second job, right? So that goes for the military people, because it can't conflict with what the military stuff is doing. And it can't conflict with anything going on the military post. So that's why they have to get permission. Well, one of the reasons why they have to get permission. And that opens up a big can of worms too. Like you have to carry your ID on you. That's a military law. That was for the military. That's not for free people. Free people don't have to carry anything with them if they don't want to. But they take the federal laws and they apply them to civilians not on federal lands, and they tell us we have to follow all these laws, okay? But back to taxes. Taxes, this is a tax of income made while on federal lands. So just like if you're in Britain and you're on the King or Queen's lands and you do anything, you have to pay a tax. And they can tell you any arbitrary amount they want because you're on their land. You're considered a tenant, okay? In America, we're not supposed to be tenants. We're not supposed to be tenants on federal lands. Why are we paying a federal tax? Impost and excise. The federal government is allowed to, at least this was a big thing back in the old days, they taxed everything coming on post and they taxed everything coming off post. One of the types of territories the federal government had was outside the Constitution, but for military purposes. So like the federal government would ask the state, like let's just make up a state, let's say Idaho. Let's say Idaho, the federal government says we need to have some land because we need to do some farming because we got to feed all these troops. And so Idaho would say, okay, well, we'll give you that land, but we're going to only give you a very little bit of lawmaking power over the land, and you can only use it for agricultural purposes. So let's say now there's a contract between Idaho and the federal government on how certain lands are going to be used, right? What they can do on it. So let's say they're making potatoes, they're growing potatoes, they're not making potatoes, they're growing potatoes in Idaho, the federal government is. And then let's say, well, some of these military people or these farmers that are hired to work for the government, they're like, oh, the government's paying for all these potatoes and I got some left over. I'm gonna make potato vodka. And so now we have prohibition. And prohibition originally was to keep the federal people from using those lands to make moonshine or whatever, because it was in the contract that the federal government would not compete with the state. The federal government cannot compete with the commerce of the state. So if the military is like, hey, we're going to use the potatoes to make potato vodka, and then they're going out and they're selling it, bootlegging it to everybody, they're competing with people in the state who are following the rules of the state and trying to make an honest living. And then the federal military people are bootlegging alcohol. And this goes on even today. I can find articles online, and you can too, about the Marines making meth in the barracks. Okay, not only is that illegal, but if it were legal, they would be competing with the state. So they would be getting a benefit from their power or their benefit of being the federal government and having a contract. They're getting an extra benefit from it, and they can't derive a benefit from an act outside of the Constitution, and they can't compete with the state. And there's all kinds of rules on it, all kinds of laws on that. So again, when it comes to taxes, we're talking about we're thinking about who owns the land. Okay, so when you go to apply for a corporate job, you're required to sign paperwork saying that you're going to pay taxes, pay a federal tax, right? And the state tax is taken out automatically, I think, or at the end of the year, whichever it is, unless you don't pay a state tax like Texas and Florida. But whose land is the corporation on? So if the corporation is not on federal lands, why are corporations doing the dirty work of the federal government and requiring people of the state to pay a tax on the income that they get, not from the federal government, but getting it from the corporation? It's supposed to come from the corporation, right? Corporation's supposed to pay its employees. Well, for one, when that happens, you've signed a contract, and there are form contracts. And another thing is you have to think about these corporations are not required, in no place that I have found, by any constitution to register to do business in the United States unless they're getting hired on as a federal contractor and doing work specifically for the federal government and on federal land. Okay, so a company off federal lands can get a contract to do work for the federal government, but those employees don't become federal and don't then pay a federal tax. So there's a lot of confusion about taxes and who's required to pay and who's not required to pay, and whose land they're on. And so these people are going out and reading the laws, and they're saying, well, it's a federal law, we have to do it. And they're forgetting, or they just don't know, that the federal government is supposed to make laws for federal things, federal people. And if they make a law outside the Constitution, nobody's required to follow it because it's outside the Constitution. It's outside their power. They can make all the contracts that they want with the state, but if I individually, as a civilian of the Republic of whatever and not state of whatever, then how am I required to comply with federal law? There's nothing anywhere that says I'm required to comply with federal law. Now, a lot of people point to the amendments. Oh, this amendment, that amendment, blah, blah, blah. And again, all those amendments can be looked at in a couple different ways. One, big, it applies to everybody. Two, small, it applies to federal people. And it is small. Remember, we've been told here and there by certain people, our federal government is very small. It is very small. It applies to only the people on the federal lands or people who want to contract with the federal government. It doesn't apply to everybody. The federal government is not our national government for people in the republics. It's the national government for the people who contract into being part of the national government, such as the military or commissioned officers. And those who become citizens by nature of marrying someone in the military, and people who are born on federal lands. People who are born on federal lands have dual citizenship automatically. They're a federal person, but they also have to they usually follow the mother, and that's an ancient law. It's amagi, and it means return to mother, means right of return. You always can follow the mother. So when you go through your ancestry and you follow, you're trying to follow your ancestral line, you always follow the mother. And that's because we always know who our mother is. Our mother knows that we know we came from our mother. We don't, in fact, know that we came from our father. Now, yes, because we have DNA, but historically, without DNA, it was that way. Okay, so let's see. Taxes. Oh, eminent domain. So eminent domain is basically the same thing. Nobody in the federal government can force anybody to do anything unless they've agreed to become a federal person by way of joining the military or becoming a commissioned officer. So if the federal government comes and says, well, we want that land because we're going to build a highway right through it, and the number they're offering you, the amount they're offering you to buy your land isn't what you like, or it's just, you just don't want to get rid of your land, there's nothing in the Constitution and there's nothing in the ideas of a republic that require people to give up their property to the federal government just because the federal government gave a good price, or just because they made an offer and the offer was commercially compatible with other lands. No, this is my property. Okay, so we think about things like the taxes on your private property that you drive around, on the roads, your registration for your vehicle, once it's paid off, it's private property. You have title. And they come and they tell you we have to, continue paying the tax on it. Well, why? It's mine. It's not yours, it's mine. I bought it. I paid taxes on the money that I bought it with, and now you're going to continue to tax me because I'm using the roads that my taxes paid for. The entire system that we have in place right now is one that's a lie, and it's been pushed on us, and it's been indoctrinated into us, and we believe it's the way it's supposed to be because we haven't been told anything else. We can't learn, we can't think, we just keep going along with everything everybody says. So if you stop and think about all the ways that what is going on now is not compatible with the type of government we were supposed to have, the type of government that the founders, people call them fathers, I call them deputies because that's what they were on paper. They were deputies, hired to do a thing, paid to do that thing. That's what they set up, or supposed to have set up. It's been interpreted, reinterpreted, uninterpreted, reinterpreted again, interpreted, by interpretation of an interpretation over the years, it's interpreted. When the first judicial act says to administer it, it doesn't say anything about interpreting anything. And everyone in the federal government is supposed to take an oath. Once they become in service to the United States, they're supposed to have loyalty to all the states, and that makes them the national people, the national military, the national politicians in Congress, in the American Congress or whatever. They're supposed to look over the nation. Us in our states, we're not nationals, we're states people, unless you join the military or you become a commissioned officer. Okay, so eminent domain and taxes, it's all, you know, the way it's done now, anti-republic. It's against the laws of what everything a Republican form of government, a free government stands for. And if you want to know more about this kind of stuff, look through my videos. I post this kind of stuff all the time. How do they get you to do it? They get you to sign contracts. You got to sign a paper. You got to sign something for everything that the federal government doesn't have a right to do. And so think about all the papers you've signed, all the things you've signed. It's a contract. It's an express contract. It's the law for you once you sign it. A contract is just like buying a car, just like buying a house. If you don't pay for your car, they either come get it, go after your co-signer, but they don't go after your neighbor. They don't go after your dad unless he co-signed. They don't go after, you know, your sister or brother, because it's not a law for them. It's a law for you in that place. The contracts that you make with the government are really not much different. The only difference is that it creates this idea that's popular, and it's a majority of people believe it, and so society frowns on you when you don't comply with the things that government says it wants you to comply with, even though the government didn't have permission to do it to you unless you signed a contract. You had to sign something. Now, the use of the Federal Reserve notes, the dollars, is a little different because there's also an implied contract, and that implied contract is when you do something you agree by doing. So remember, we went over Austin's book, How to Do Things with Words, and saying something is doing something, but doing something is also doing something. You're by saying it, you're doing it. Okay, so when you say I bet, you're making a bet. When you say I do, you're marrying or you're swearing. And that's an act, that's a deed. It means something. It's you have done something. You didn't just say it, you did it. So when you use the Federal Reserve notes, you're consenting to an implied contract. Okay, and so you're required to pay the tax. You're accepting the Federal Reserve notes. You know, you're giving it in trade for something, and so it's contractual. It's an implied contract, and so you have to pay taxes on it. So that's this video for today. Please like, share, subscribe, watch some of my other videos, post this on your social media, wherever you have it, and I'll have more videos coming out soon. I'm still reading the book Towards a Theatrical Jurisprudence by Merritt Leiboff by Rutledge. Okay, if you want to go ahead and get started on that, I'm reading it. I don't know if I'll do a video on it or not, because I don't know if I like it or not. It's got a lot of information though. If I could encourage you to read something right now, I guess it would be Plato's The Law. Okay, that also has to do with theatrics in law and how people are historically prone to drama and entertainment. It's just the nature of our being, I guess, and that's something we've always done. So, okay, like, share, subscribe. See ya.